Good evening. Good to see each of you here this evening. We are continuing our Bible study in the book. This evening we're in the book of 1 John. We're, in theory, we're going to cover all John's epistles this quarter, but we'll see if we actually get clear there. So it's good to see everyone. We are on lesson number 8 in our book, Brotherly Love. We have been talking about the idea of that John has presented to us about being children of God, being born of God, as opposed to being of the devil, the opposite of that. We'll continue this evening talking about brotherly love. This is, of course, obviously a characteristic of those that are born of God. But, as we jump into our study this evening, I'd asked Brother Daniel if he would to lead us in prayer before we begin. We're going to be covering, I guess, the second part of, or second 2/3 of chapter 3 this evening. If you'd like to turn there, I'm going to read beginning in verse 10. In this, the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was the wicked one and murdered his brother. But why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Do not marvel, my brethren, if the world hates you. We know that we have passed from death to life, because we love the brethren. He who does not love his brother abides in death. Whoever hates his brother is a murderer, and you know that no murderer has eternal life abiding in him. We'll stop right there for the moment and talk about his passages here. So, can we tell the difference between a child of God and a child of the devil? How? By the clothes people wear? By the pitchfork the child of the devil carries? By what they do? The idea that John talks about here, we can see that the child of God practices righteousness. And it's pretty obvious the difference of those that practice righteousness and those that don't. And what's the other thing that John mentions here that is an identifying characteristic of a child of God, besides practicing righteousness? Loving the brother. When you think of loving your brother or brotherly love, which is the subject of our discussion this evening, what does that mean to you? Cynthia.
It's an unconditional, strong affection for a close friend or a relative.
It's an unconditional, strong affection for a close friend or relative. And that's the relationship that God not only recommends, but commands that we have for one another. Do you ever have, let's see, what's the right way to put this? Not so loving thoughts about some of our brethren? The congregation here, or maybe others that you know from other places? Has any fellow Christian done something to you that has really aggravated you? I see some. I didn't witness this myself, but I remember this example in Bible class when I was a teenager. The teacher was talking about something that he had seen when he was growing up, was that two men who were actually at Sunday morning service waiting on the Lord's table and literally got into a fist fight. Now, that's not brotherly love. I've never seen anything like that happen. I hope none of you have ever seen anything like that happen. But we certainly have seen brethren that have not gotten along. That's not what God is talking about. We've all been aggravated, I think, from time to time with people. Hopefully not with brethren, but that probably happens every once in a while. I know I have done things that have upset people. I'm sure each of us has. But what John's talking about is working toward that attitude where you are not going to be doing that, at least practicing those sort of things. Yes, Tom.
I just want to make the observation. I think what has happened, and I think what has happened in this lesson, is that our author has conflated brotherly love with agape love. Yep. And brotherly love is what I think Cynthia was talking about, which obviously is what we need to strive to do. But I do believe that the concept of agape love doesn't mean that you have to like the person. Because God loved us, as is demonstrated in Romans chapter 5. And so the point that I would make, when you talk about the relationships we have with one another, there are going to be times people are going to be testy. They're going to probably irritate you and things of that nature. That's the nature of a family. You take it, the bigger the family, the more they're going to bother you. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is that like is not necessarily what is being emphasized here, that we like one another, but it's that we love one another, that even the brethren who have a way of pushing your last foot, you still love those people. You go out of your way to be kind to them and look out for their best thing. So I think we have to be careful that we don't conflate brotherly love with phileo love with agape love.
Yes.
Two completely different things.
Those of you that Tom is talking about, there is a difference between phileo, brotherly love, and agape love, unconditional love. To some extent, I think that the author did get these a little bit conflated here, but the reality is what John's talking about is this brotherly love, this concern for our brethren, and the idea that we are looking out for our brother's best interest. If we all are doing that, then we all will get along better. We won't be pushing one another's buttons. We won't be aggravating one another nearly as much. It won't eliminate it, but it will significantly reduce it. One of the things that I learned early in my marriage to Jo is some things that I could say that would really, really aggravate her. It's taken me a lot longer to learn not to say those things. And sometimes I still don't refrain from saying things I should. when we think about this, those of us that are here in this room, each one of us, if I want to show of hands, how many have a goal of going to heaven? Everybody. Now, if these are a bunch of people you don't get along with, why do you want to spend eternity with them? Those of us that are not practicing brotherly love, not practicing righteousness, won't be there. And if our attitude is that I really don't love my brethren, then the brethren don't need to change, I need to change. Yes, Peggy.
I have a question because his father is I do have to pray for all of us all the time. But I also pray for the people in Iraq, and I don't have problems with them in Russia, whatever it's going on. And so does that mean I didn't go to heaven? Because I think somebody else should have died.
I certainly think we all need to be concerned and pray for everyone because every individual soul is important to God. But there are things that people do that are that God hates. But God does not hate anyone. God hates sin. God hates our actions or our inactions that are sin. Yes, Tom.
I would just make the observation that I think what John is also talking about is those who we are constantly in contact with. I mean, it's good to pray for our brothers in Ukraine. Well, it's good to pray for our brothers in Russia. Does anybody think that those people want this war to go on? And it's so convoluted, nobody knows really what the facts are. And so instead of coming down heavy on these leaders, because I suspect that Zelensky guy is just as corrupt as Putin, what you have to do is look and pray for your brothers in those places. But that's not what John is actually addressing. He's talking about how we interact with the people who we actually interact with. I'm not going to interact with brothers in Ukraine. I pray for them, but I'm not going to interact with them. But I do interact with you folks. And sometimes you drive me nuts. And I drive you nuts. So what winds up happening is we learn to love one another despite all of that.
And sometimes the people we know the best drive us the craziest. That's an excellent point, Michael. If you don't care about them, or they didn't care about you, or you don't care about them, you wouldn't drive one another crazy. In my physical family, my two sisters drive me nuts more often than not. But we get along really, really well when we're hundreds of miles apart. But with that said, John talks about really, I think it's pretty apparent, the difference between how we should be as children of God and born of God compared to born of Satan, born of the devil. And what's the example that he uses? Who does he use? Cain. And what do we know about Cain? What? He killed Abel. Because Abel was such a horrible, wicked person, right? Because Cain was the horrible, wicked person. He was of the devil. Yes, Todd.
I think it's really easy to say that he was a wicked man altogether, but I think the better warning to us is he may not have been a completely wicked man all the time, but he was trying to please God, but he was not way for him?
Well, I think there's a variety of things in that which we maybe don't necessarily need to get into tonight, but Cain certainly with his actions, his sacrifice was not acceptable to God. So what his motive was for doing it the way he did it must not have been the same motive that Abel had. Abel is held up to us as being righteous, and Cain as being of the devil. And certainly his actions in killing his brother, the jealousy that he had, the reaction that he had when it was pointed out to him that you need to do better, you need to do this different. And his reaction was not one of contrition, of repentance, of change, wanting to do things God's way. His reaction was to lash out at someone who really was not involved in his shortcomings. And we can see the obvious difference in Cain and Abel here. And we're going to, in our from time to time and day to day, we're going to be in contact with people that are not our brethren. And they're not going to react to us the way that our brethren do and should. In fact, in verse 13, John says, "Do not marvel, my brethren, if the world hates you." How many of us want to be liked by people? We all do, don't we, Peggy? We want to be liked. But the reality is, as a child of God, we are not going to be liked by a vast number of people. Partly because I think, like Cain, by us following God, it puts a spotlight on the fact that they're not. Cain, when he looked at, and Abel was held up as an example of how this is how you do it. He became mad at Abel for doing what God wanted, not looking at himself, saying, I should do better, I need to do different. The world a lot of times looks at us and lashes out at us for their inadequacies. We should never be lashing out at our brethren for our inadequacies. There are many of us that have a lot of different types of talents and skills. When we look at one another, we should not feel jealousy that someone else can do something better than we can, or do something, or that we should feel superior because we can do something that someone else can't. That's not how God's family is supposed to work. We are supposed to be considering one another. This is an idea that basically John is repeating what Jesus had taught already. In John 13, verses 34 and 35, it says, "There a new commandment I give to you, that you love one another as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." Jesus lays out how we should love, the way he loves us, the concern that he has for us. That's the kind of love we're supposed to have for one another. And I think this, to some extent, gets over into agape love, but with what Jesus is talking about. But he's also talking about that familiar concern for one another. Jesus didn't want the Pharisees to reject him. Jesus didn't come here to push people farther away into sin. That's the reaction that some had, not following him. That's not what he wanted. He came to fulfill God's plan. He came for us. He came for the ones that rejected him. He came for everyone. And we can take that example and realize that it's something that we need to do. We need to be there for every one of our brethren. There are some maybe that we have a closer relationship with than others. That doesn't mean that we don't have the same concern, the same care for everyone. I think I mentioned this before. I made a mistake up in Charleston and used an example, and there was a lady there, a very dear lady named Carolyn. And I used an example that Carolyn was my friend, but she wasn't my best friend. But I loved her. And of course, she never let me forget that phrase that I'm not her best friend. In fact, if she walked in the door tonight, she would tell me, "Hi, friend." Not my best friend, but "Hi, friend." There are some of us that we maybe are closer to than others. Yes, Leo.
One thing I think we're missing a little bit is the context of 1 John is the great concern John had for warning these people about these false teachers. And the fact that these false teachers wanted to deceive these people. And it seems that one of the characteristics of these false teachers is they had a particularly poor lack of regard and love for the brethren. And he was saying a warning sign of how to identify these people is their lack of love. Their brothers. That warning is there.
And I think Leo has a very good point that John basically is warning about this lack of love, this lack of concern for one another. If we are living our lives the way we should, we'll know that we have the concern for one another like we ought to. If you walked in here tonight, and I'm going to pick on Cynthia for just a moment, and you came in and Cynthia was distracted with something and she didn't say a word to you when you walked in, is your first thought, why did she snub me? What's wrong with her? That shouldn't be our first thought, should it? Our first thought maybe should be, I wonder what's distracting Cynthia. Maybe there's something I can help her with. There's a big difference in that attitude, isn't there? That's how we need to be looking at one another. And John even says there in verse 15, whoever hates his brother is a murderer. That's serious. We look at murder as one of the most serious or heinous crimes that people commit. John says hating your brother is the same as murder. That's how important it is that we don't hate our brother. So, why is it that maybe there are some that don't love their brethren the way they should? Yes, Todd.
Circumstances come up, and either we're immature, probably at least immaturity on both parts, and you don't deal with it, let it fester, instead of going at each other and at least agree to disagree. You just let it keep going and going and going, and little things that you would typically forgive someone else for, if that person offends you again, it just adds more to the fire. So the gist of it is we need to go and forgive each other.
We need to go. immaturity. That certainly plays a big role in this, doesn't it? When we are not acting like adults. We're acting like spoiled brats. Yes, Hazel. Yeah, our first thought shouldn't be jumping to the worst conclusion that we could possibly come up with, should we? We should be coming up with the best thought we can come up with. Yes, Cynthia.
One of them continues what Hazel said. You know, you say, well, like, they didn't invite me to come with them to do something, or they didn't speak with me. Well, did you invite them, or did you speak to them, or show love to them? Two-way street. Or did you encourage them? And the other one is ingratitude is a big part of selfishness. Is if we remember how unlovable we are and that God loves us, how can we possibly withhold love from someone else?
Ingratitude is a big problem. It's selfishness. Cynthia said if we recognize how unlovable we are and then God still loves us, shouldn't we be loving one another? I think the reality is if the love is not there, you've got one group of people, they're not Christians anyway. They're not brethren. You've got others that are immature, like Todd was talking about. And then unfortunately, I think you also have those that have turned away from God. They have fallen away. In Hebrews chapter 3, in verses 12 through 14, the Hebrew writer says there, "Beware, brethren, lest there be in any of you an evil heart of unbelief in departing from the living God. But exhort one another daily while it is called today, lest you be hardened through the deceitfulness of sin. For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast to the end." If we find ourselves no longer loving our brothers, no longer loving our fellow Christians, that ought to be a significant wake-up call for us that we are not behaving the way we should. We are not exhibiting righteousness. We are not walking in the light. So if you find yourself really aggravated with me, first of all, let's talk about this, because I know I can be aggravating. I know that I can do things that will be frustrating. As Tom said, drive you nuts. It happens that way. It can be that way. Let's look at the last few verses of what we want to try to cover tonight. Beginning in verse 16. "By this we know love, because he laid down his life for us. We also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. But whoever has this world's goods and sees his brother in need and shuts up his heart from him, how does the love of God abide in him? My little children, let us not love in word or in tongue, but in deed and in truth. And by this we know that we are of the truth, and shall assure our hearts before him. If our heart condemns us, God is greater than our heart and knows all things. Beloved, if our heart does not condemn us, we have confidence toward God. And whatever we ask, we receive from him, because we keep his commandments and do those things that are pleasing in him, in his sight. And this is his commandment, that we should believe on the name of his Son, Jesus Christ, and love one another. He gave us a commandment. And now he who keeps his commandments abides in him, and he in him. And by this we know that he abides in us by the Spirit whom he has given us. I think this shows us Jesus as the ultimate example of how it is that we should love one another. John talks about that he laid down his life for us. And we ought to lay down our lives for our brethren. We ought to have enough concern for our brethren that we would sacrifice everything, including our life. But John very quickly pivots, I think, to something we need to do that. We're probably not real likely that we'll be called to lay down our life for our brethren. If we are, then we should. But John talks about something else there, doesn't he? There, starting in verse 17. If we have this world's goods and our brother has a need, a true need, we should not shut up our heart and not love him, and not. What's sacrificing a little bit of our stuff for one another? That's what the attitude we should have. Yes, Cynthia.
What's even harder for most people is not sacrificing stuff, but sacrificing time. Spend time.
Stuff. And as Cynthia says, as important or more important than our stuff is sacrificing our time for one another. Sometimes what a brother needs is someone to talk to, or even more, someone to listen to them, someone to be there for them. In the book of Job, when Job is suffering from the loss of his children, the loss of his health, the loss of his wealth, and his friends came to be with him, they sat there and didn't say a word for 7 days, showing their support for him, showing their love and concern for him. Now, when they started talking, they got off into some tangents. We won't get into that this evening. But we can be there for one another, and time is tremendously important. Sometimes someone needs a hand moving some furniture. Sometimes someone needs a hand getting somewhere. Sometimes someone needs something. And how is it that we know what our brethren need? We have to get to know one another. If we don't know one another, we don't know what we need. If we're not there sharing with one another, if we're not there concerned about one another, not looking out for one another's best interest. Years ago, when we lived in Kansas, there was a brother there that we worshiped with who was blind and needed a ride to services. And we would take, his name was Marion Bailey, we would take Marion. As far as I know, no relation to all the Baileys here, but he may have been. But we would take Marion to services, and our oldest son was about, I guess, 3 or 4 years old maybe at the time, and Danny really enjoyed talking with Marion, but really couldn't understand why that he couldn't, just didn't register that he couldn't see. So as we would drive down the road, Danny would point things out to him that we would be driving past and say, "Did you see that? Look at that." And Marion really enjoyed that. But Joe and I probably got more out of that experience of taking him to services than he got from it. I mean, he got a ride. We got to know him, understand him, and have insight into his life. That's how we love one another, share with one another, getting to know one another. That's important. The kind of love that Jesus has for us is what we need to be striving for to have toward one another. We understand and know that helping a brother when they have a need is important for us to do. How many times are we too busy? We not paying attention and don't notice someone's need. Are we like the priests and the Levites who go out of our way to walk around the Samaritan that was injured and hurt? Or not the Samaritan, the one that was hurt, the one that was helped by the Samaritan. Do we cross the road and walk on the other side of the street to stay away from someone in need because we can't be bothered? That's not the example that Jesus has for us. That's not true love. And it's our deeds and our actions that make this real. It's not just lip service. It's more than shaking someone's hand here at the building and, how was your day? And as they start to tell us how their day was, we just shut them out, ignore them, and turn away. It's truly listening to one another. It's not talking at one another. It's truly being concerned. And when we do this way, it gives us an assurance that we are truly of God. In verse 14 here, an interesting thing that John says here, we know that we have passed from death to life because we love the brethren. It's one of the ways that we know that we are truly children of God. We have passed from being captive to sin and being dead. And we're now alive. And we can know that that's true because we love one another. And if you find yourself doubting whether you're loving the brethren like you should, then maybe you haven't put aside sin the way that you should. But John tells us that because we do love one another, we can know. We can have confidence. We can have an understanding that we are truly children of God. I've done a lot of talking this evening. I know, appreciate y'all's comments, but I'll probably be talking more tonight than I have. Yes, Peggy.
They have helped me many times go to the hospital or x-rays or doctors or brain waves or anything. But these men and women around there, they're wonderful. I've never seen a congregation that has so much brotherly love and love and sisterly. I mean, and it really helps the person.
I won't even begin to try to repeat what Peggy said, but I will say I agree completely, Peggy. We have a wonderful congregation here that shows care and concern for one another. And I just encourage everyone to keep it up, keep doing it, and work toward being better at it every day. Yes, Leo.
Thank Peggy for that, and I think one thing that contributes to that is realizing that we're all undergoing a spiritual battle. So some of us might not have many physical needs, but there's always a battle going on
every one of us. The fact that we can influence and help one another. I think one of the questions you asked earlier, do we all want to go to heaven? I answered yes. The question after that might be, do you want to help your brother to get to heaven? You better answer that yes, because if you don't, you may not get there yourself.
That's an excellent point, Leo. We all want to get to heaven, but if we are not really concerned about whether our brethren get there, then there's a real high likelihood we're not going to get there ourselves. Yes, David.
One thing that I was thinking about as I was doing this lesson, Jesus is that ultimate example we have. His death, I guess, what you'd say is that ultimate sacrifice that he made for us. But what about the sacrifice that we make every day? He came to fulfill God's plan and to seek and save the lost. Well, do we do that every day just like he did? All those things. To me, that would be a good example. Our everyday challenges we come up on. It's the things we should look at too.
There is a challenge to do this every day, isn't it? Day in and day out. Jesus certainly was here fulfilling his Father's commands every day. Verses 22 and 23 tell us a benefit that we have by doing this, and it's that whatever we ask, we receive from him if we are keeping his commandments. Our prayers are effective if we're keeping his commandments, if we are practicing righteousness, if we're born of God. And the implication certainly is our prayers won't be effective and they won't be answered if we are unrighteous, if we're not keeping his commands, if we're not living our lives the way we should, if we're not concerned about one another the way we should be. And we are, I believe, got 2 minutes left. Any last comments from anyone this evening? Yes, Tom.
This would take me a long time to respond, but this part, I think, is giving a lot of people trouble. The way that our author analyzes, particularly what is found in verses 19 and 20, that is one way to understand this passage, but I don't think that's the best way. Because I don't believe that what he is saying here is what our author is pointing out, and now that if we're troubled by our conscience because we haven't kept the law of God, God's greater than our conscience, and he's really going to come down hard on us. I don't think that's what he's saying. I think what he's saying is people are trying to live their life faithful to the Lord. They love their brothers and sisters. And yet what winds up happening is sometimes they get this feeling like, am I doing enough? And so their conscience begins to bother them. And I believe that what John is saying here is that God is greater than our conscience. He knows what we're doing. Even if we think we're not doing enough, God is greater than our conscience, and he knows. How do we therefore have confidence? And the confidence is by the way we demonstrate love with one another. So here I am, I'm trying to live a faithful life as a child of God. I struggle in it. I feel bad. I think that, God, he must be really perturbed with me. Well, the way you ease your conscience is look to see how do you treat your brothers and sisters. And God is greater than our conscience. He knows more than we know about our lives. And so therefore, we can have confidence before him. And I think that to me is a much more comforting way of understanding this. Because we all struggle in our walk with the Lord. And yet, if we love one another, we can have that kind of confidence. Just as you said, this is how we demonstrate it. So, I guess what I'm trying to say is if your conscience bothers you, you need to see why it bothers you. But God is greater than your conscience. Are you loving your brothers and your sisters? Then you are in the right relationship.
And we can know whether we're loving our brothers and sisters. And that should give us confidence that we are children of God. I'll just say amen to that. and we will stop for this evening and see you all next week.